Has enjoyed the food and entertainment provided by our gracious hosts. And we're going to now continue with the afternoon's program. First, my apologies for the delayed start, but we're hoping that we'll be able to make up some time as the afternoon's program progresses. My name is Nick Ishmael Perkins, and I'm the director of SciDevNet, which is an online news service that's focused on science and technology for developing countries. And it's a pleasure for me to be here and facilitating a session which I think gets to the heart of the interests of those of us who are innovators and fans of innovation. In the terms of reference for the session, there are a couple of questions which the organizers have identified as central to the discussion that we're going to have in a bit. The first of these questions relates to the transformation of economies across Africa from consumers to exporters and producers of knowledge. And what we would like to do over the next hour and a half is to explore what that means, and also to look crucially at the kind of policy environment that might require. One thing that's worth reflecting on here is what we mean by policy environment. Are we thinking of one policy sphere, or are we thinking of several spaces where policies of different sorts may be created and implemented? The other thing that I want to reflect on as we're about to start the discussion is that, as some of my colleagues were saying this morning, we've been talking about innovation for quite a long time. Somebody this morning was referring to the Togo Plan of Action from 1980. And the fact that actually only 4 countries have reached that target. I think that we really ought to take on some collective responsibility here to make this event as catalytic as possible, and by extension to make our discussions somehow as contributive to step change as we can. And I think there are a few things that we should be drawing on as we do that. One is actually to avoid speaking in generalizations and being generic or vague, but try to be as specific as we can be. The second thing is really for us to be mindful of some of the assumptions that underpin, as it were, the received wisdom around how innovation happens. And I see it all the time in documents that I read. And the third thing, and we already had a bit of that this morning, and I thought it was very interesting, is to remember that innovation is really about cross-fertilization between different systems, and to use that to present different paradigms. So this morning, for instance, Bright Simmons was talking about bringing the analysis of political economy to the way that innovation might work. I myself have seen people talking about complex adaptive systems and what that means for innovation. I'd like us to do more of that kind of thing, because I think that's the sort of stuff that will hopefully galvanize us and provide some concrete steps forward. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the speakers. I think that the conveners have done a very good job, actually, of pulling together some folks with a refreshing breadth of experience for the discussion. First of all, Ade Aboedan is the chair of the Africa Space Foundation, and he's also the founder. And Ade started his education in the US, actually at the University of Washington, where his career highlights included a stint as an engineer with the US Army Corps, as a research engineer as well with the Boeing Company, and he is also a lecturer at the University of Ife in Nigeria. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at the National Research Council of Canada, became a successful and celebrated remote sensing specialist, before he joined the UN as an expert on space applications, where he was for nearly 20 years. He's written 5 books and authored up to 70 articles, and continues to be very active as a speaker and an advisor in various capacities, including a special assistant to the President of Nigeria on space science and technology. We also welcome Fernando dos Santos, who is the Director General of the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization based in Zimbabwe. Previously, Mr. dos Santos was the Director General for Mozambique's Industrial Property Institute, and he is a lecturer in competition law and in industrial law at 2 different universities in Mozambique. And he was the author of the Africa Copyright and Access to Knowledge Country Report for Mozambique. And finally, we have William Aseko, who is the CEO of the Investment Climate Facility based in Tanzania. Mr. Aseko was with the Attorney General's office in Kenya for 7 years before he joined the private sector, where he spent a long time with Coca-Cola. And before joining the Investment Climate Facility, in fact, was the president of the Coca-Cola Africa Foundation. And when he since joined in 1995 in Coca-Cola, he has moved through the company and actually been posted in several countries, including the US, Morocco, and the United Kingdom. Okay, without much ado, I'm going to now invite each of the speakers to share with you their reflections for around 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'd like to open very quickly, actually, to the floor, because I'm sure there are lots of you with lots of ideas, and indeed probably a few questions. Okay, I'll start actually by inviting Mr. Ade Abudan.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Can you have my slide up, please? I can't see it here. Oh, okay, right, I can see it. Okay, good. Do we have a control? Okay. Basically, I'm going to be looking at how we can move Africa forward within the framework of innovation. Good, thank you. Thank you. Please come back. Okay, I see it, I think, yeah. And I have that outline just to help you have a better understanding of some of the things I'm going to be saying. I may not indeed address each and every subject there because of time, but let us go on. Now, I'm not going to define innovation. I think John, our moderator for the first plenary today, did the best job on that subject, so I'm moving forward. And now, here's the core of my presentation. Many of us have been talking about applications and ICT. The question, and I think somebody in the last workshop here in this room raised the issue of the foundation for all this innovation in ICT development in Africa. And that issue has not been addressed. And that is how I'm going to begin here today. And that is to reflect on the fact that a gentleman by the name of Socrates in the year 500 BC or thereabout was the first individual to say that man must rise above the earth and beyond the atmosphere, for only thus will he understand the world in which he lives. And it is from that plateau in outer space that we've been examining the earth, we've been communicating with ourselves. The Montgolfier brothers of France in 1783 were the first to actually confirm the predictions given by Socrates. Then you have a lot of people, such as these three gentlemen, Constantine, Goddard, and Albert in Russia, US, and Germany, who perfected the rockets that we use in launching satellites into space today. Now, that's the first satellite that went into space from Russia on October 4, 1957, and that has changed the world in which we live today. So whether you have a GPS or Earth observation, you have a satellite, the foundation is through that particular satellite. Now, again, here in Africa, we benefited, and we were the only first to benefit from that when the first Prime Minister of Nigeria after independence and Kennedy in the US had their first two-way telecommunication. And that was the first time two leaders in the world spoke via satellite in 1963. Now today, Africa is benefiting from all these inventions. How? Egypt, for example, has 3 satellites in space for communications. RASCOM has 1, Nigeria has 1, and then you have Congo and Angola. Both of them are planning to put their satellite in space. And if you want to understand what these satellites are doing, how do you recognize where they are? And those are the maps or the footprints of those satellites in space as we stay in this room today. So whether you have a GPS or so, or your computer, they are communicating with these satellites. But basically not this particular satellite, because before these satellites came into being, the African market was already saturated by satellites from Europe, from North America, from Russia, and so on and so forth. Now, we were asked in preparing for this lecture not only to look into space or anything, but what has been African contribution. Now, this gentleman is a Ghanaian. Just you met his counterpart here earlier this morning, smart, bright rather, and he developed the same thing that Brad was talking about, except that in his own case, in addition to making use of this concept in verifying the authenticity of drugs, his application is now being used in virtually numerous products and is being sponsored by companies like IBM, Gucci, Rolex, just to make sure that their products are not fake. Now, you also have other actors in Africa that are being sponsored or being influenced or being encouraged to participate in innovation. And the most important one that I'm familiar with, there may be others, is the African Innovation Fund through the Innovation Fund for Africa. And in those 4 areas, that is where they are doing their work today. And they have given 4 awards so far in 2012 and 2013 to those individuals from Egypt, from Tunisia, from Algeria, and from South Africa in the areas identified there. Basically, I'm putting these slides here to show that Africans themselves are contributing to innovation. Now, when we talk about innovation for Africa, what are we talking about? Does Africa need it? Now, and my statement to that is shown in this particular slide, that a country commits itself to innovation for only one reason: to grow and to create jobs for its own people. Full stop. Everything else is just an embellishment of that for me. But to happen, the government must commit itself. The government, as the enabler and driver of innovation, must come up with the necessary policies. Now, there are other factors. Is Africa ready for innovation? When you look at the fact that the price I just mentioned earlier, IAP, about over 1,300 inventions or creativities of Africans were assessed in the last 2 years, that shows that Africans are doing a lot. Now, but as indicated in the morning, a lot of people are afraid of innovation. Why? Because of their own vested interests. And I now put a caveat there: vested interests at home and abroad. At home, for example, people who are selling generators, they don't want your electricity to work. So, and people who are running trucks, they don't want the railway system to work. Okay? Then abroad, countries that are innovating far ahead of you don't want you to innovate to catch up with them so that they can sell their products to you. It's just as simple as that. But the biggest problem I find in innovation in Africa is the participation of African innovators in making sure that their rights are recognized. An example is a Kenyan and Tanzanian professor. They found a malaria cure, and before they knew it, the product came out of Japan. The question: what's the correlation between the research result in Africa and the product in Japan? And that product is now selling over 12 million mosquito nets in Africa today. Who gets the benefit? Okay. Now, and I show you why is innovation necessary for us. We need jobs. It will enhance the quality of our lives and also reduce our scientific dependence on others and give us a sense of confidence. That is, we can do it, we can achieve. We don't need anybody to help us more than we can help ourselves. Now, then, what are the prerequisites, the policy prerequisites? And here I give some statements. This is from an Indian gentleman, and this statement was made in 1979 or thereabout. Mr. Batatali said that it is the environment, is the quality and character of the man will function based on the environment you provide him. So now I now look at the requirements of such a policy, and I have them listed here. And you can read some of them later if you cannot go through, but because of the time limit, I'm not going to go through them one by one. So, but for me, there are 5 policy ingredients that each country must fulfill before it can accomplish this. Then, and this is the second set, I have 8 of them. Now, but we need education to get this done. So I look at the type of educational systems that are available globally, not in Africa alone. And there are many countries that are doing immersion programs for kindergarten people, secondary school, university people, in summer camps. South Africa in 1998 did what they call YEAST, Year of Engineering, Science and Technology, for the people, for a whole country. Then there is STEM, which all of us are familiar about, enrichment in science, mathematics, technology, and engineering. In Africa today, the average African student in secondary school and university is afraid of math. Why do we have to teach these subjects as if they are roaches? They just memorize them. Where is the application concept? People are not applying, therefore they are not understanding. Then our universities. For Africa to be recognized internationally and be able to sit on the conference table, it has to go there with the knowledge. There must be knowledge base. And our entrepreneurs must participate. We need the private sector. Without that, there'll be no innovation. Innovation needs to generate it through the entrepreneur and the individuals who are going to fund what I call angel investors to do anything. We need the research here. Now, again, when you talk about innovation, we need to sustain it here at Africa. And the question is, how do we sustain it? An innovator cannot stay still, because if you stay still, others will catch up with you and advance higher than you do. You go back to Microsoft. They started, I don't know, Windows, whatever they started with. But you have Windows 97, then you have XP, now you have Vista, then you have Windows 7, now you have Windows 8, and now you have Windows 8+1 or 8+2. The inventor has to continue inventing because of the competition. Okay? Then Africa is overblessed with a lot of inquiring minds all over the world. You are in Malaysia, Singapore, United States. There's no university in the United States that is worthy of its name that does not have an African professor. So why are these talents not being used in Africa? Why there? Because we have not recognized that these individuals, they need to be encouraged to stay home and contribute to the development of Africa rather than the development of other countries. And where we refuse to recognize them, they take their talents abroad. Then the leadership, the political leadership, the need to recognize that Africa's land is more than enough to grow enough food to feed Africa and make it a food export society. But right now we're dependent on others to feed us. We need to sustain our innovative concepts to be able to move on in the field of agriculture. Then, in the area of, I just already mentioned that, in the area of knowledge, we are only doing application, but somebody is developing that knowledge that you are applying. Suppose that person did not do it, he didn't manufacture that product, or even if the product is manufactured but it's not available to you at any price, what are you going to apply? Africa needs to contribute. Then, if you go to Addis Ababa this year, and you heard it on the radio, AU is celebrating what we call 50 years of Africa Union, or Organization of African Unity. When that organization was established 50 years ago, President Nkrumah of Ghana made this statement. I consider it to be a very visionary statement. The question is, what have we done for the last 50 years to carry out this vision? As a result of that, what has happened is that the African Union has now focused on the next 50 years. How can we transform Africa in the next 50 years? And that is their goal right now. Now, the I'm missing one slide, and I don't know where it is. I gave you examples here in this case, but just a second, I'm missing one slide, yeah, and this is it. I've spoken about is Africa ready for innovation. I've spoken about who is afraid of innovation. That is a very key issue for me. When an African minister will tell you it's not going to give you money for research because you can bring that technology from Germany or from Britain or from the United States or Japan or China to implement. So what is happening to all the African talents? And why are we educating this community of people so that they are rendered useless? So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, let me share my conclusion with you. And that is, I consider this a very unique opportunity, a very blessed opportunity for all of us. And so I raise these issues. What will happen to that image of the dark continent? And you know what I'm talking about when I say the dark continent, because that is what Africa has always been referred to since I've been born. And I'm over 65 years of age. And that's what I've been hearing all my life. We are the dark continent, okay? But what will happen if we have just a very few vibrant innovation hubs in each country in Africa that can identify the problems of the individual countries and come up with proposed solutions to them? And similarly, where will Africa be in the next 10 years if at least 50 of its universities and research and development establishments embrace knowledge generation that can be transformed into products and services through the efforts of African entrepreneurs and angel investors? And the problem Africa has is that it's not short of innovators, but African entrepreneurs and African angel innovators are too afraid to commit themselves to make investments. But the truth of the matter is that you will not have your cell phone today or GPS or computer if somebody did not bite the bullet and make the investment, whether they fail or pass. And you can never do well without making an effort. And when you fail, you learn from your failure. It's not the end of the world. Then secondly, I said, by the time we finish here on Thursday, can we agree to establish study groups that meet on the internet and develop innovative concepts which will address and solve some of the problems that beset our continent today? Now, and I'm part of a group called the African Leadership Conference of Space Science and Technology for Sustainable Development. And we established such a study group to understand the equator, because most of the satellites owned by African countries today that are observing the Earth, they are going to North Pole and South Pole. But the problem of Africa is at the equator and the tropics. We need satellites that will go around the equator rather than going North-South Pole. Then finally, at this very minute, and I want you to examine yourself, where did your glasses come from? Maybe Italy, maybe China. Your shoes, maybe Clark from London. You as an African, when you come out of your house in the morning, what part of you is African except your body? Okay? Your wristwatch is Rolex from Switzerland. Okay? So I want us to think about this, because at this very minute, someone somewhere in this world is working on or developing an idea that can change your life and mine for the better. The question is, what will each of us here do in the next 365 days to similarly change the lives of others for the better? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ade. It's very inspiring. You made reference to the challenge for innovators around the protection of their intellectual property rights. And that segues quite naturally into our next speaker, Fernando dos Santos, who is the Director General for the Regional Intellectual Property Organization. Fernando.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And I think that the presenter that preceded me has facilitated my work because has already raised the issue. And in many occasions, the problem that we really have is how can we foster innovation using intellectual property? Because in many occasions we will see, and I will show you some numbers, that people have even some doubts if in Africa if the Africans innovate. So there's a big challenge in how can we integrate intellectual property in our innovation policies. Just quickly to tell you about the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization, it was established in 1976, and its headquarters are in Harare, Zimbabwe. We have 18 member states, which are located in Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and then Western Africa. So we have been working all these years, it's almost 30 years, and trying to harmonize our laws and policies in the area of intellectual property, and to make intellectual property work for our development. Now, going straight to the issue that brought us here, which is related to innovation. If you look to the numbers, you will understand that the majority of, when you talk about technological information, 80% of that technological information, will find it in the form of patents. This morning, there was this discussion and some presentations made which show that, of course, when we talk about innovation, we're not restricting ourselves only in technology. But it was also reiterated that the technology is an essential part of the innovation processes. Now, all this information in the form of patents is information that we need to access, and we need to contribute to it. When we look to the situation in Africa, and the question also was raised before, is what is Africa is contributing to this innovation? But are we protecting that intellectual property? Are we finding ways to share this knowledge in the world in order to contribute to the innovation that is happening in the world? If you look to the some studies that were undertaken and the relationship that exists between development and innovation, you will find out that the most developed countries also shows good numbers in terms of protection of intellectual property. We don't want to create here a correlation, a direct correlation, whereby we say the number of patents correspond to development. But it shows that in the majority of the case, where there is awareness and willing to protect intellectual property and reward the innovators, it also is translated in terms of development. So it is an area where, in Africa, we need to think seriously. How much of that technological information, how much of that innovation that is generated here in Africa is protected, and it is used to foster innovation in our continent and in the world globally? If we look to the numbers in terms of protection, I will bring here the example of patents. You will find out that usually in Africa we don't protect our innovations. Usually in Africa we don't show the innovations that are happening. And the protection of intellectual property in Africa, and let's say in the least developed countries, it's only in a small percentage, 2% maximum, 3% maximum. So it means that there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of innovation that is hidden somewhere. As a RIPO, we are working in this area, and it is our mandate also to deal with patents, to deal with the other rights that are related to innovation, like utility models and industrial designs. If we look to our statistics, we will see that in the last years there's a positive trend where more and more patents are registered in Africa, are granted in Africa, but they are still a very small number. I've said here that in the world we have more than 70 million patents that are in force. How many of those patents are protected in Africa? Very few. Very few, and we're talking about small numbers, even in an international organization, a regional organization like ARIPO. I brought some numbers here. I don't know if you'll be able to see them. Since we started to protect intellectual property in 1984 at ARIPO, if you look to the number of patents that are protected, they are very few. It's more or less 7,000 patents in the whole organization, which is composed by 18 member states. But what is more striking is who is protecting intellectual property in our continent. And if you look to the numbers, you will find out 30% of the patents that we protect at ARIPO are from the United States. If you scroll the top 10, you will only find one African member state, which is South Africa. All member states of ARIPO, they are not in that list, in the sense that they have very few patents that are protected. If we look to the African countries, the patents originating from the African countries, again you'll find at the top, of course, is South Africa. But then very few patents from our continent, very few. I'm talking about 30 years of protection of intellectual property. I'm not talking about a year. The numbers that I'm showing here may correspond to the number of patents that are protected by one university in the developed world. The same happens if we look to the industrial designs, another area, another important area which shows innovation. And you will once again find out that in this case we have a country like South Korea, which is the top filer of industrial designs in our organization. Then you find South Africa. Our numbers in the continent, again, very few. And in the area of industrial designs, this is an area where a local input is very much desired, is very much needed. Again, if you look to the numbers, you will see that they are really ridiculous. So if we go back to the question that was posed by my predecessor who was speaking here, the response is very clear. We are not protecting our intellectual property. As I indicated before, the number of patents, the number of industrial designs do not correspond to the innovation that is happening in the continent. That means we have two problems. One is that we are not innovating, and I don't believe in that. I believe that there's a lot of innovation happening in the continent. But the second thing is that most probably what is happening is that we are not using this important tool to protect and to use the innovation that is happening in Africa to foster development of this continent. And if you want to follow the trend that is happening in all the world, of course, you have to take into consideration the issue of protection of intellectual property. So what can be done in order to reverse this situation? And we can bring a number of examples. As I've said, and I've shown in one of the graphs, the situation is improving, but very slowly. The number of patents, the number of industrial designs that are registered in the continent are increasing. But we should do much more than what is happening now. And if we look to some examples, and I am bringing here the case of Kenya, before 1995, there was no local patents, meaning that the local innovators, they never patent their inventions. But the things started to change at a certain point because there was a firm decision and an undertaking from the government to educate the people on the importance of use of intellectual property. And a number of laws were then reviewed, and an IP strategy with the assistance of the World Intellectual Property Organization, the process was started, a committee was formed, and there were a number of stakeholders that met and discussed the issue of how to integrate intellectual property in the innovation policies in the country. We also saw a very positive trend where research institutions, universities started to incorporate in their policies also an IP policy. The impact of that was immediate, and you could see that slowly people was starting to use the system for their own benefit. And you could see that the country, and this was given there were examples that were given during this event, whereby we find that in Kenya more and more we found that reverse engineering is happening, local products are coming out, and this is something that must be taken into consideration. So it is a trend that should be followed. My contribution, looking to what we have been witnessing in the last years in the organization, in the member state, is that it's crucial that each of us, when we're talking about innovation, we take seriously into consideration the issue of integration of IP in those policies. This means that there's an effort that must be done at the national level, but also at the continental level, to take seriously the issue of IP and integrate it into our policies. In many situations, we're having difficulties. It's difficult to explain to people what is intellectual property and what is the importance and how can this contribute to the development of our countries. So this means that there's a lot of effort that must be done in terms of creating awareness of the public, of the institutions, of the public sector, of the government, of the entrepreneurs, and the academia also in the use of intellectual property. And we need to promote the use of IP in those people who are generating intellectual property, who are using intellectual property. And I followed some of the panels this morning where we're discussing the issue of the importance of having hubs, clusters, but within those hubs, within those clusters, it is important to also take into account how the knowledge that is generated is protected, and there is an added value to what is happening through the use of intellectual property. Many of these things that we're discussing, transfer of technology, licensing, they're based on existence of intellectual property rights which are protected, so that then you can have a good instrument to then go and negotiate with any partner. So intellectual property is present in each and every moment of the cycle of innovation. When we think about the moment the idea is created, immediately intellectual property must be taken into consideration. And in all other phases of development of the innovation, of the invention into innovation, into its commercialization and licensing. In each and every area of the innovation cycle, we need to add value by using intellectual property. So I believe that as we are talking about innovation, as we are talking about partnerships between the different sectors in the area of innovation, we need to consider what is the input that can be given by using intellectual property. The public sector, the governments, the international organizations that are dealing with intellectual property, they still have a lot of work to do in terms of awareness in bringing the right policies to change the situation in the continent, to protect the intellectual property rights, to come out with the initiatives in terms of how do we reward the innovators and inventors in Africa. But on the other side, we need to create an interrelation between the government policy and what is happening in the industry. So industry needs the products of invention. It needs innovation. So how do we create those synergies? How do we create this synergy and relationship between industry and the research and development institutions and universities? All this includes the use of intellectual property. So I think that as we go forward, we need to learn from this experience, and we integrate in the policies of innovation the issue of intellectual property. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. It's very sobering statistics and I was very struck as well by your diagram suggesting IP as a lubricant of the innovation cycle. Reflecting on how we might create synergies between industry and public policy, I'd like to invite William to now talk to us a little bit about those reflections as the CEO of the Investment Climate Facility.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I'm going to be perhaps a little bit more practical in terms of my approach to share with you some ideas that I have come through or experiences that I have had throughout my career, which has been quite unique, particularly as it relates to policy making. I first started my career in government with the Attorney General's office in Kenya. And in that capacity, I was a policy maker. I then went and spent a long time with a private sector company that is invested all over the world and very, very heavily invested in Africa. And in that capacity, I was a beneficiary of policy. Today, I work in what might be called loosely civil society. And I run an international organization called the Investment Climate Facility for Africa, which works with governments to bring innovative processes and methods to service delivery to their citizens, and more particularly to private investors in their countries. And in that capacity, I guess I'm an influencer of policy. So this experience throughout my career has led me to come up with these observations that I'm going to share with you about what I believe to be key ingredients towards making policy that can inspire innovation. First of all, let me just say that I do not think that there is any silver bullet. There are any laws or regulations or policies indeed that you could target specifically towards innovation. I think that innovation arises under a certain set of circumstances, and it is in understanding the impact of your policies on innovation that will create an atmosphere or an enabling environment for innovation. So throughout my career, and particularly in the last few years that I've been working with the civil society, I've traveled throughout Africa, and I have seen government from within when I worked in government. I've seen government from without when I worked in the private sector, and now I work with government as a partner. And I've seen three key things that I think are barriers to innovation. This morning we heard from the Prime Minister of Cape Verde about how they had been successful in innovating and creating new services, new methods of delivering service to their people. And I asked him the question, how did they avoid the difficult challenges that many other African countries that are trying to do exactly the same thing have failed? And he mentioned two things. The first, he said, was that there has to be very strong political will to drive the innovation through. And we know that political will is a barrier to many things in Africa. But more so, there can never be innovation in a repressive environment. If there is a repressive government, the first thing that will die, the first thing that repressive governments do is they kill innovation. Because repressive governments are by their very nature conservative, and they do not want change. They want things to remain the same. So he said political will was very important. Big, big barrier to innovation in Africa. The second, what he said, was leadership. The leadership, the person that is leading the innovation, that is leading the change, has to be strong. Because another big barrier to innovation in Africa is resistance to change. Now, we talk about innovation, particularly in Africa, as if it's a good thing, because really the new ideas that we've seen in Africa have been hugely beneficial. You know, M-Pesa in Kenya, you know, very, very beneficial to those of us who live and work in Kenya as a payment method. It's being replicated in many other countries in Africa. But not all innovation is viewed positively by everyone. And if many of those people who are not viewing innovation positively are in positions of influence or power, you then will have trouble getting your innovation through. So leadership and an ability to overcome resistance to change are very important. And the third key ingredient that I've seen that is a barrier to innovation in Africa is we haven't had a system that rewards innovation, that recognizes innovators in a way that makes them feel that it is worthwhile to share their innovations. I know we've just heard from previous speakers about protection of intellectual property rights, and that is a key ingredient. That is very, very important in promoting innovation so that your ideas can be protected. However, protection in itself is not enough. The next step, as we've heard from previous speakers, is commercialization, some method of rewarding and recognizing the innovator for their efforts. So what does all this mean? Well, my argument is that the greatest innovation, an innovation that has been transformative, not just in Africa, but throughout the world, has been innovation that has been driven by an environment that recognizes and rewards those innovators. And many times there have been new ideas, I would admit, where the person that came up with the idea was not ultimately the beneficiary of the recognition and the reward, but those ideas were then taken by others and commercialized. So it follows that commercialization is an important part of innovation. It follows, therefore, and commercialization means private sector. It means private investment. It means investing capital, and it means a reward or a return on your investment. It therefore follows that the private sector, a healthy environment for the private sector to flourish, is a very big driver of innovation. And as you develop your policies for innovation to promote innovation, you cannot be developing those policies without developing policies that allow your private sector to flourish. The second big thing that has been a driver to innovation has been demand. If you think about the greatest innovations over the last 20 years that have revolutionized the way we do our things, the way we listen to music, the way we store and search our information, these innovations created a great demand for those new ideas. So it follows that a big demand, a big market is very important for innovation. And today, largely, as the world becomes smaller and smaller, a global village, the market is available to most Africans. Today, you can develop an app in Nairobi, and if it's accepted, put it on iTunes or the App Store, and it's available to the rest of the world. So you have a big, big market, and that's a great driver to innovation, and it's tied into the commercialization that I spoke about. So my argument is this, that in order to have a policy environment that favors innovation, start with your private sector. Start with your enabling environment that allows investors, both foreign and domestic, to invest in your economy, to create demand for products and services. In this way, you begin to create that very demand for innovation that has driven innovation in other parts of the world. In 2007, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Friedman wrote a book, The World is Flat. It was a very popular book, and I'm sure many of you read it. His argument was that globalization, and particularly the developments around information technology, had equalized the world. And therefore, it didn't matter whether you were sitting in Washington, D.C., or you were sitting in Mumbai, India, you had the same opportunities. You had the same opportunities to innovate, you had the same opportunities to make money and to invest, to study, and to do things that were otherwise not available to you because of the advances of information technology. And he was right. You know, a lot of back office services that used to be located within Western economies were moved to the East. You had a lot of companies that were offering services based in the West move to the East. They were able to do this because of technology and because of globalization. And Thomas Friedman's argument was absolutely correct. But a few years later, another gentleman by the name of Richard Florida, I believe, wrote another book which was an antithesis to Thomas Friedman's book. His book was entitled The World is Spiky. In other words, it's not flat, but there are concentrations of populations that are moving and coalescing together for a reason. And his argument was that they are moving and coalescing together for the reason of innovation. They were moving to those urban spots or those countries that promoted or allowed innovation to happen. And his argument was right as well. And if you look at the countries and the cities and the communities where these populations coalesced for the purposes of innovation, they all had one thing in common. Well, three things in common: an enabling environment, an ability to protect your idea, an ability to easily commercialize your idea, and an ability to have a very big demand for that innovative idea very, very quickly. So Africa cannot be different from these. We have to look at all these policy environments and make sure that we are allowing our private sector to flourish, because they are the drivers of innovation at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William. I think without much ado, I'm going to invite you to ask questions of a panel and also to share your reflections. What I would like to do is ask you to keep your contributions relatively brief, ask you to use the microphones that are available. I'm not sure if they're roving mics, but there's certainly mics in the aisles. And before you begin, please be sure to introduce yourselves so that we can follow up with you afterwards. I'll start with the gentleman in this quarter just here. Yes, that's right. I may interrupt you if I think that anybody's going on for too long, because we don't have that much time left.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Bakari Diallo. I'm the head of the African Virtual University and based in Nairobi. My question is more on the intellectual property rights. As you know well, in software and now education content, we talk a lot about open licenses, like the Creative Commons license. In education, especially, it's very important. For instance, if you look at Cape Verde, you have several universities. In each of the universities, the state is paying for lecturers who are developing courses, but they are perhaps keeping these courses to themselves. And there is a lot of duplication because they are developing the same courses in different universities. And this is a case in Africa, in a lot of parts of the world. So there is what we call the open educational resources, where, for instance, there is a special license where you develop a course, you can release it as open educational resources. You are always recognized, but anyone else in the world can use it. And I'm just wondering, because we are at AV, we are promoting this in a lot of African countries, if our colleagues who presented on intellectual property right, I just wanted to have their take on this and what their organization is doing in terms of open licensing. Thank you.
It's a very astute question, because I think that this is something that's going to transform the publishing industry. In fact, it's happening already. I was speaking to a publisher in London who said it's not a question of if, but when this is going to transform our industry. So I will start by inviting Fernando.
Oh, thank you very much for this question. This is a very interesting area where I also have worked. And of course, all students, everyone who studied in Africa knows the difficulties that we have in our institutions, have access to the books. And I was part of a project that was developed some years ago at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And we discussed the issue of access to knowledge. And this is a very important area because indeed, when we're talking about intellectual property, we need to look also to the issues of those factors that can hinder development. So we know that there's a lot of discussion on the contribution of intellectual property on development, because there are some people who say that, of course, intellectual property can block access to information, can block access to knowledge. So this will be exactly the opposite of what we're looking for. But we have to be careful to say that there's a number of possibilities that we have, and even in the most hated instrument that is around in the area of intellectual property, which is TRIPS, it talks about flexibilities, meaning that there's a possibility to have access to information and to knowledge, even where intellectual property is present. But we have to remember that we have been discussing here on the issue of intellectual property, looking to the perspective of that the innovator, the creator, who also needs to have incentives to continue to produce. These two areas, they are not opposite to each other, although there is a lot of discussion on that. So it is possible to use the open access instrument, open education tools within the legal framework that talks about protection of copyright. And those kind of initiatives, they are very welcome, and they are important for the development of our continent. I may say that I was very impressed by the sentence that was quoted this morning about from Amilcar Cabral, saying that no matter how the water can be hot at the source, but will never cook your rice, or that will not cook your rice. Meaning that you need to use the available resource to your favor. And this can be done in Africa. And there are a number of initiatives that have been developed using the open education tools, open access instruments, and which are not violating intellectual property rights. There is also, I was reading about a very interesting initiative also in Brazil, which also try to put at disposal of students educational materials without violating intellectual property. So these things are not opposite to each other, and it is possible to have a conducive environment to reward the creators and the innovators, but at the same time avoiding to block access to knowledge. And this is what we have to try to avoid and try to promote in our continent.
Thank you. Can we have one more question from, yes, the gentleman just next.
Thank you. My name is Agri Ambali. I'm from the NEPAD agency. My question also goes to Fernando. We seem to have a solution to a challenge, but I don't know why we're not scaling it up. The case of Kenya that you've cited, whereby there was an intervention, and indeed with that intervention, the number of patents registered basically has increased. Why have we not been able to replicate this in the other 17 countries of ARIPO? So I really wanted to hear from you as to basically why it has been a challenge to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I may say that the example that I've given of Kenya is really a matter of example. Those positive trends, we are witnessing them in a number of countries. They are happening. But this needs a lot of effort. But this must be a political will, as was indicated before. I came from an experience where I started by working in a national IP office, and I had the privilege to initiate that office where there was nothing, and it was difficult to talk about intellectual property at that time. And with that same effort, a number of things has happened in the country, and today we see a lot of developments happening. The same initiatives that we were undertaken in Kenya, for example, in the case of Mozambique, where I come from, we undertook those initiatives, educating people about the importance of intellectual property, talking with innovators going around the countries and bringing the innovators and helping them to register their patents. And the numbers also have grown a lot. So